Hi everyone, this is a short video on a very basic macroeconomic model, very simple, the business cycle. The model shows output on the y-axis and over time on the x-axis there's going to be changes happening. This can be related to the PPC model where there's a potential output, and normally you would have actual outputs being somewhat less than the potential because there's always going to be a situation where you can't fully use all of your resources. There'll always be some level of unemployment in the economy of some type of the resources, and the actual output just simply fluctuates as seen. However, for the purposes of our model, we actually bring that potential output down and make it almost redefine it as the most realistic potential output available so that the actual output can even temporarily go beyond the potential at certain times, and that's when the economy is actually really employing too many resources, and that cannot be sustainable in the long run. And below actual outputs that are below the potential means that there's going to be definitely some resources not being employed. So here's how it works over the 4 phases. And we also call this the long run trend for the purposes of the business cycle. The overview is this, that from peak to peak or trough to trough, that is one cycle, naturally enough. And we're going to go through the 4 phases of this cycle. The first 2 phases is the expansionary phase, going from the trough to the long run trend at the middle there, and then further expansion occurs from the long run trend to the peak. And then what we have is the contraction after that. And this naturally happens because what's happening at the peak is that there's an unsustainable level of production, that there's overuse of resources. It could be overtime of labor. It could be overuse of the physical capital when in fact there should be repairs made and maintenance made. And when that starts to slow down and indeed more expensive resources being brought in, then suddenly the same level of production cannot be maintained and a natural contraction occurs. Taking a look at the 4 phases in detail now. Phase number 1, let's start at the intersection of the long run trend and the actual output. Over phase 1, that's the boom, where it's looking really good in the economy, that there's full employment, and you're getting growth really beyond what you've experienced before. But like I say, once you reach the peak, then that's unsustainable. There's a slowdown beginning to occur in phase number 2. But in both these cases, there's increasing growth overall in the economy. The problem happens in phase 3. That's when the recession occurs, because a recession being defined as 2 negative quarters of 2 quarters of negative growth, and then that means that there's actually a slowdown in the whole economy. Worse than just less growth, it's actually negative growth. And while you're there below the long run trend, we're continuing to experience negative growth, and yet a recovery will eventually occur when prices get so low that there's more risk being taken by entrepreneurs and consumers alike, and there is a more positive attitude in the economy and growth begins to occur. In reality, exactly when negative growth actually occurs and how long is not necessarily that precise when we're thinking of the business cycle. The recession is definitely going to be the aspect of negative growth, but in the recessionary phase, as it were, may just be very small positive growth or close to zero, and people often see that as the lower end of the business cycle as well. So some examples over the years, we can see that this is from actual data, and there's these fluctuations that you can see in a variety of countries where there's the ups and downs, but very few went below the peak, except back in the big recession of 2009, where just about everybody, except Australia in this case here, and I remember, of course, China did not go through a negative growth period, but everyone had a slowdown during this time. But these other countries definitely went negative. So it's pretty rare to go negative, and otherwise the fluctuation occurs over time. Just a little further note, because a big issue is about predicting, although it's not really strictly on the IB curriculum. But you have to understand that that there are all kinds of indicators that economists look to decide whether or not there is a change in the actual output as per the business cycle happening, and that's what a lot of economists will look like. For example, what's happening at the same time as the actual business cycle is levels of production and investment as what you would expect as well, and imports, and not so much the exports, because quite often there's already contracts in place for exporters to continue to export their product, and that will be more of a lagging indicator. But definitely what's also lagging as well are inflation and interest rates, that it takes a while for the actual money markets to react to what's going on into the actual economic markets. Unemployment also lagging because there's a delayed effect in both hiring and laying off workers. But what would anticipate such economic activity changes are inventory levels, so that we see that firms are, if they're starting to build up inventories, then they know a slowdown is on its way, and vice versa. And of course, um, surveys for both consumers and producers on what their expectations are. What are they sensing out there on the street, as it were?